Here's one look at where NASA's Artemis programs are at the beginning of 2024. These are the 6 Artemis programs that are under the Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate. These were reorganized under the Moon to Mars Program Office last year in 2023. These are the baseline dates for the next 3 Artemis missions, and then the gateway that will support Artemis IV. These dates are, in some cases, over a year old, but these were the dates that were published in the President's budget request about a year ago for fiscal 2024. Right now, for current public status, the Exploration Ground Systems program is getting Mobile Launcher 1, Pad 39B, and the SLS solid rocket boosters ready for Artemis II. The Mobile Launcher is out at Pad 39B right now, testing the upgrades to both the Mobile Launcher and the pad systems there. And the SLS SRB motor segments are in the rotation, processing, and surge facility at Kennedy Space Center. And EGS is preparing the aft assemblies for stacking on the Mobile Launcher sometime later this year. The Gateway and Human Landing Systems programs are approaching what's called Phase C in the NASA life cycle. Phase C is the final design and fabrication phase, and so there's a key decision point before those programs formally transition into that phase. Orion and SLS are also focused on Artemis II as well. The main work right now for those programs for Artemis II is completing test and checkout of the Artemis II Orion spacecraft, and the same for the SLS Core Stage. For the xEVA program, that is managing development of a lunar surface spacesuit, that program is ahead of the preliminary design review, so it's still in that kind of Phase B point in the program. Axiom is developing that spacesuit for NASA, and so that's something that the preliminary design review and critical design review were scheduled to occur at the end of 23 and in the middle of 24, and so there's not a lot of information that's released on that development, but that's the understanding based on a recent Government Accounting Office report. In terms of watch items, based on what's public right now, the EGS, Orion, and SLS programs have done a lot of post-flight review of the Artemis I mission. And right now, the Orion program is still investigating the behavior of the base heat shield during the re-entry on Artemis I. The wear patterns on the AVCOAT base heat shield were a little different than predicted, and so they're doing a root cause investigation on that, and that'll continue into the spring. There were also a series of in-flight anomalies that were categorized for all 3 programs, and something that we're looking for an update on is just whether there are any open items remaining from those for the 3 different programs. In terms of hardware and processing milestones and production milestones, Orion is in the middle of integrated test and checkout of the Artemis II spacecraft. The next major integrated test is is a vacuum test that will be done will also be done in the operations and checkout building at the Kennedy Space Center. The spacecraft is currently in a final assembly and systems test cell, the FAST cell. When it's ready for the vacuum test, then it will be moved into an altitude vacuum chamber that was renovated. And so what we're watching for is to see when that occurs. Another big milestone will be when Mobile Launcher 1 rolls back from Pad 39B to the vehicle assembly building. It will roll into High Bay 3, and that will signify that the testing at the pad and of the upgrades is completed, and that the ML is ready to begin preparations to stack the Artemis II vehicle on it in High Bay 3. Another thing that we're waiting for is, as mentioned, is an update on the status of Core Stage-2. Boeing was in the middle of final integrated testing of the stage, and then, as I'd mentioned, they have a couple of weeks of they have 2 to 3 weeks of detailing of the stage and preparing it to be shipped, and then it would go on the Pegasus barge and be transported to the Kennedy Space Center. And so one of the things that we're watching for is to get an update on the status of testing, the status of completing production, and then an update on what NASA's thinking in terms of delivering the stage from the Machute Assembly Facility in New Orleans to the Kennedy Space Center. And then the last one on this list anyway is when NASA will decide to start stacking the solid rocket boosters on the mobile launcher. During Artemis I, we were reminded periodically about a 12-month stacking clock. The boosters have, in a generic sense, a 12-month limited. They are limited to 12 months of being stacked. NASA, through analysis, extended that quite a bit of time, but this time for Artemis II, they want to wait until the right time to start stacking, and not necessarily eat up a lot of that clock before the rest of the vehicle is ready to stack. So those will be two stacking milestones that we'll be looking for here in the next few months. The first one being placing the aft assemblies on the mobile launcher, and then that first segment-to-segment mate, which is the aft center segment. So the aft assemblies, the first 2 of the 10 segments go on the mobile launcher. The clock's not started yet. Once the second set of segments, the aft center segment for both the left hand and the right hand boosters, are stacked on top of those aft assemblies, that's when the 12-month clock would start. So that's something that we'll be looking for in the next few months to see. It'll give us an idea, at least, about how the Artemis II schedule is moving relative to that end of the year target. For beyond Artemis II, we're still going to be looking at the Orion and SLS programs as they do the builds. Those same 2 elements are going to probably drive the schedule for the readiness of the EGS, Orion, and SLS elements for Artemis III. So production of the crew service module by Lockheed Martin, and production of the SLS core stage by Boeing. For the Gateway and HLS programs, we're looking to see when the cost and schedule baselines for the Option A, which is the Artemis III Starship, when that will be released, and then for the Gateway co-manifest vehicle, which is the power and propulsion element and the habitation and logistics outpost. Those 2 elements will be launched together. We're looking for a cost and schedule baseline for that launch of those initial 2 elements. And then for the xEVA lunar spacesuits program, we're looking to see when the critical design review occurs. It was scheduled for August, but we're still waiting to hear the status of the preliminary design review, which was expected by the end of 2023. And so now we can go into this in a little bit more detail, but just to kind of provide an overview at the top of where things stand. for the Artemis programs. But now we can go into these in a little bit more detail. This is a look ahead that was released about a year ago. This was a slide that was presented at NASA Advisory Council, the main council meeting in January of 2023, and these were the milestones that were expected to be completed during 2023. So the Artemis I post-flight analysis review was completed, but there are still open items, and there were several in-flight anomalies that were identified across all three programs, and some of those we don't know what the status is of those, whether some of them are open, or some of them are closed. So that's something that we're waiting to hear about. If we just concentrate on the Artemis II milestones, the mobile launcher crew mods were completed, so that's complete. The LH2 sphere was completed, and then that's being tested right now. The multi-element verification and validation testing is actually going on right now between the mobile launcher and the Pad 39B systems. The Artemis II booster processing was started, and that's because the booster segments were delivered to Kennedy Space Center in the late September, early October timeframe. If we look at then looking at the SLS, milestones, still waiting for an update on the core stage status, but it's still in New Orleans at the Michoud Assembly Facility. The ICPS for Artemis II has been at Kennedy Space Center for years, so that's been delivered, but then the Orion stage adapter and the launch vehicle service adapter are still at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. We can take a look at a few other things here. So the Artemis III ICPS was delivered by United Launch Alliance in the middle of 2023. The booster segments are complete. Those have been complete since 2022. The Space Shuttle main engines, those adaptation changes for the third set of engines have already been completed, and those engines are in storage at Stennis Space Center for the third core stage. When that build is complete, the third core stage manufacturing is not complete yet. That's something that we'll be watching during the year. But if we just stay focused on the Artemis II milestones, the crew module, the base heat shield was installed on the crew module. The crew module and service module mate was completed, or was started, if you want to call it that. The physical connection of the two was in mid-October. The combined crew and service modules were powered on, and the launch abort system hardware for the most of it is already at Kennedy Space Center, but there are still a few fairings and elements that were being processed at Michoud when I was there in mid-October, when I was there reporting for NASASpaceflight.com. In terms of current public status, Exploration Ground Systems, Orion, and SLS are focusing on Artemis II as the top priority while they work on preparations and planning for future missions as well. But right now, EGS is working on multi-element verification and validation testing at Pad 39B. So the mobile launcher rolled out to Pad B from the West Park site in mid-August, and since then they've been working on a series of tests. This was a graphic that Public Affairs put out referring to I think these are Integrated Systems of Verification and Validation Tests, or ISVV. The main upgrades to the mobile launcher were adding an emergency egress system up at the top of the launch umbilical tower, or certainly parts of it, where the slide wire baskets will be staged. And then wires are run from the top of the launch umbilical tower down to the terminus area. And so that was the major set of upgrades. Of course, there was a lot of refurbishment of the mobile launcher after Artemis I. So all of those systems that were repaired and refurbished were also being tested while the mobile launcher remains at the pad. So in addition to the emergency egress system upgrades, there was an upgrade of the environmental control system at the pad. There was a second liquid hydrogen sphere that was constructed and installed at the pad over the last several years. The sphere was actually almost completed before Artemis I ended up launching, but now that sphere is being integrated into the launch control system. So that includes doing a fueling test, flowing liquid hydrogen through both spheres. The spheres are going to be tied together. It's still not totally clear exactly how they're tied together, but they will use both of those, the capacity of both of those. One of them is about 800,000 gallons of usable capacity, and the other one's over 1 million gallons of usable liquid hydrogen capacity, if I recall correctly. But they want to test that system out, being able to control the flow of liquid hydrogen from both spheres through the cross-country lines up into the mobile launcher, and then eventually it'll terminate somewhere prior to the umbilical plates that would actually connect to the core stage, and then also to the skids. There's a skid, obviously, that runs up the launch umbilical tower for the interim cryogenic propulsion stage as well. So that's shown here as test 4. Test 6 would also be sort of a detanking test, practicing drying out the propellant lines, etc. After doing a cold flow test. And so the first test was a crew launch day demonstration, and that was done in September. The crew went through the timeline for one of the first times. Where they got suited up, went through the whole procedure of being taken to the pad. The closeout crew was also there. They go up to the crew access arm level, and then go into the white room. They're already suited, but then they'll put on the final the final pieces of their suits, like their gloves and their helmet, and then they would get into Orion for launch. They will go through another sort of a more high fidelity test at some point once the SLS and Orion are stacked on the mobile launcher. That is, they were talking about doing that in the vehicle assembly building. Essentially a countdown demonstration test without propellants being loaded. But there's also been talk about doing that out at the pad too. So that may be something that is still being traded back and forth, or maybe they'll end up doing, maybe they will have time to do tests in both locations. So that's something that we'll be waiting to hear about. They've also done several runs of what is shown here as test 3, which is water flow tests, running the water from the large water tower at pad 39B through all of the plumbing into the mobile launcher, deck, into the platform. And that ignition, overpressure protection, and sound suppression system has been tested multiple times while they're out there. This is a shot that we would not get on launch day from a drone, just because it wouldn't be safe to position it there. But this shows the initial flow of the water into the flame hole, and you can start to see the flow into the rainbirds. But the water is dumped into the flame hole for the core stage engine ignition of all 4 RS-25 engines, and then then you get an initial flow prior to T0 onto the mobile launcher 0 deck through the rainbirds, and now you see the full flow, which is timed for SRB ignition to serve those purposes. Again, the ignition, overpressure protection, and sound suppression as the vehicle climbs away from the launch tower. We have not seen any confirmation or status of the other tests. So the tests of the cold flow tests of the liquid hydrogen from the new sphere through the cross-country lines into the mobile launcher. We have not, and then the emergency egress system. The last update that we got about the emergency egress system testing was that they were running pilot lines from the launch umbilical tower down to the terminus area, but we haven't seen any footage or status about tests with the slide wire baskets and running the baskets from up on the top of the tower down to the terminus area. There were expected to be several tests with different different weight loadings in the baskets. There was not a plan for any personnel to actually ride the baskets down. They would basically simulate the weight of 2 people in each basket. I think the baskets can hold up to 2 people per basket. So the idea was just to simulate that with ballast, essentially. For the Gateway and the Human Landing System programs, those are the initial operating capabilities for those programs are approaching Phase C. For the Gateway, that's the co-manifested power and propulsion element we can see in this render on the left, and then the habitation and logistics outpost module, which will be ground integrated on the right. The graphic in the lower right, this is a Northrop Grumman presentation slide from a few years back. The graphic in the lower right there shows how the PPE and the halo will be physically connected to each other with this inner element adapter. And you can see on the left, Northrop Grumman has enumerated some of the changes to the halo module now that it is not going to be a free flyer. The power systems have basically been removed. All the navigation systems have been removed. And the PPE now has to make a long duration transit from a high Earth orbit, highly elliptical Earth orbit that the Falcon Heavy will deliver the co-manifested vehicle to when it's launched, out to that near rectilinear halo orbit where the gateway will reside. For HLS, the NASA program is monitoring development by SpaceX of its Starship system and the lunar lander variant of Starship that will support Artemis III. There's, of course, been extensive coverage of the Starship flight tests that began in 2023, and those are expected to continue throughout 2024 as well. beyond the flight tests that are going on right now, HLS is looking at when the demonstrations of the technology that are needed to support Option A for Artemis III, when those will occur. Right now, SpaceX is focused on the launch and entry, descent, and landing portions, of the system. So when this key decision point C review occurs is going to be, will provide more insight into the schedule and also any perhaps impacts to Artemis III, either in terms of planning or schedule. Orion and SLS are in test and checkout of the Artemis II spacecraft and core stage, respectively. For Orion, which is still considered to be the critical path in the schedule, the crew module was mated to the service module in mid-October, and that's several months later than originally expected at the beginning of last year. The mate of the crew module to the service module moved from the middle of 2023 to the late summer, and then finally it was completed in mid-October. You can see in this picture the base heat shield with the protective tape over the bottom of it. The back shell panels on the upper part of the crew module will be installed later in the production flow. In this shot, this shows the crew module being after it had been lowered into place on the crew module adapter part of the service module. This is in the final assembly and system test cell, the fast cell. And then this is a shot a little while later, after the platforms had been lowered down around the crew module. The next big test is that vacuum test, and that'll be conducted in the altitude/vacuum chamber that was recently renovated in the operations and checkout building at Kennedy Space Center. This is a graphic from a NASA presentation showing the relative locations of the altitude chambers. I believe the one on the left is the one that was renovated. They were originally built for the Apollo program and for doing similar testing with the Apollo command and service modules, which were also produced in the ONC building. The fast cell is in the far background in this picture on the left, nearest to the back wall there. So, and then on the right, you can see the configuration that Orion will be in for this vacuum test. It will have, I believe that the back shell panels will be installed similar to how Orion, the crew module, was configured externally for the tests at Plumbrook Station for the Artemis I vehicle. Of course, that's now called the Armstrong Test Facility in Ohio. But you can also see in this case the service module minus the solar array wings again. But in this time, the spacecraft adapter cone at the bottom there can remain installed, and that'll save time in terms of production and getting from completion of the test to the handover to exploration ground system. So there will be, after that test is completed, they will have to install things like the solar arrays, but then they'll also be installing the service module fairing panels around that will encapsulate the area below the crew module adapter down to the spacecraft adapter cone there. For SLS, for Artemis II, the Boeing is the prime contractor for Core Stage, and it is completing production of Core Stage 2 at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans. After testing is completed, the stage will nearly be ready for its barge trip to Kennedy Space Center. The delivery date for the stage has changed quite a bit over the last couple of years. Originally, the stage last year, the stage had been expected to be delivered to Kennedy Space Center well ahead of when it was needed, but it was still expected to be delivered to Kennedy Space Center in the middle of 2023, and that's now slipped apparently out of 2023 and into 2024. For the lunar surface spacesuits that Axiom is producing for NASA, the recent GAO report indicated that the program was somewhere just prior to the preliminary design review that was planned to be conducted at the end of 2023, in leading up to a critical design review in August of this year. And so those dates and that schedule was based on supporting the December 2025 launch date of Artemis III. And so we'll have to see. That's one of the big watch items, is the Artemis III schedule. But then if that is updated, then we may also see updates to the other Artemis III elements, not just these Axiom spacesuits, but also HLS Starship, and also Orion and SLS production schedules. Those could also be adjusted if the Artemis III schedule is adjusted this year. These are some of the watch items for Artemis II at the beginning of 2024. NASA is continuing to investigate the performance of the Orion base heat shield during Artemis I, which was different than pre-flight predictions. Investigations into the root cause were expected to continue into the spring, and one of the questions is what, if any, impact there might be on Artemis II. A series of in-flight anomalies were also categorized for the different EGS, Orion, and SLS elements from their Artemis I performance. While the flight was successful and the performance was excellent according to NASA, we are still watching to see if any of those in-flight anomalies are still open items, and also for any impact on Artemis II planning and preparations. The big picture question is the Artemis II schedule, and while we're waiting for status updates on that, here are some of the next milestones we're watching for. For EGS, we're watching to see when Mobile Launcher 1 rolls off Pad 39B and into the vehicle assembly building. That will signify that testing at the pad is complete, and the next step would be to prepare the mobile launcher for Artemis II stacking. For Orion, we're watching to see when the integrated crew and service modules are ready for that vacuum test. That is the last major test and checkout series that Lockheed Martin needs to complete before completing production of the spacecraft and handing it over to EGS for Artemis II launch preparations. When we spoke to Orion program officials in last August, they indicated that there was about 3 to 4 months of integrated testing after the crew and service modules were physically mated together before they would be ready to do the vacuum test. So that structural attachment occurred in that mid-October timeframe. So if it's 3 to 4 months, then it's probably somewhere, out in maybe the February timeframe. And then that vacuum test was expected to take some number of weeks. And so what we'll be waiting to see is how close they can get to that end of April target for handing over to EGS. It was expected that handover would be at approximately the launch minus 8 months point. That it would take about 8 months from that point until EGS could be ready to launch Artemis II. And so you can, if you do the math, end of April would translate to approximate launch readiness at the end of 2024. If it goes past end of April, then you would expect the launch readiness to go past 2024 and move into 2025. The major piece of the SLS launch vehicle is the core stage, and the last update that we got on that was in October, when Boeing and NASA were hoping to complete the testing and then complete production of the stage by the end of 2023. We're watching for an update on the status of the final integrated functional test campaign, and then the new schedule for completing the stage, and then I guess the new schedule for when the stage would be transported on the Pegasus barge from New Orleans to Kennedy Space Center. When we were there for NASAspaceflight.com to get an update on production at Michoud, the FIFT had started. They had just completed the initial power on of the flight computers and the avionics to do a health and status and initial check of all of the avionics to make sure everything was connected and talking, and that the communications were as predicted. They were then going to move into a sensor channelization set of tests that tests all of the different types of flight instrumentation on this vehicle, which is still heavily instrumented. The first two vehicles have a very similar amount of test instrumentation on it. So they're testing the operational flight instrumentation, engineering flight instrumentation, and development flight instrumentation. And the latter category being there's a lot of development flight instrumentation on Core Stage 2 as there was on Core Stage 1. And so they have to make sure that all of those individual measurements are correctly calibrated, correctly read, etc. Once they finish the channelization, they were going to move into stage to engine interface and leak tests. And then they would move into main propulsion system, pneumatic, and thrust vector control hydraulic functional tests. After the leak tests were complete, one of the lessons learned from the first core stage build was that the engine leak tests used a lot of helium, and helium is a very expensive commodity right now. So one of the things that they deferred was installation of the final liquid oxygen feed line segments for both quote-unquote downcomers on either side of the stage. So that segment 5 will be installed after they complete the leak tests. At this point, we would expect that they've already completed that test. They were planning to complete all of the functional testing by the end of November, and certainly perhaps by the end of the year. So for the thrust vector control hydraulic functional testing, that would include gimbaling the engines in final assembly. That would be a first for Michoud, and so that hopefully we will get to see some video of that, but there's no guarantees there. Once the FIFT is completed, they'll do a break of configuration review, and that might that will allow them then to start breaking down the access platforms inside the stage. That needs to be done in order to rotate the stage to different orientations to complete final thermal protection system foam sprays and installation of covers for shipment. And that would, once they get that done, that was expected to take 2 to 3 weeks. That would essentially signify that the stage was ready and the team was ready to do the pre-ship review. And then once that's completed, then they would move the stage over to Building 110 and basically put it on the transporter to then roll out to the barge and then ride in Pegasus to Kennedy Space Center. Then the other another thing that will bear watching, of course, is when does solid rocket booster stacking begin? Orion assembly and test, that schedule is still considered the critical path for Artemis II, but another one of the milestones that we're watching for is when SRB segment stacking begins. The boosters have, as I was mentioning before, the boosters have a standard stack life of 12 months, which we became very familiar with during Artemis I, during the launch preparations for Artemis I. But NASA recently noted that they want to look at when the right time would be to start stacking the segments. That life-limited item clock for the boosters, again, starts when the first segment-to-segment mate occurs, which would be the aft center to aft assembly mate for both the left-hand and right-hand boosters. So we'll be watching to see not just when stacking begins with the aft assemblies, but when the next two segments are attached. Beyond Artemis II, we are also watching the other programs and hardware production as the year begins. For Artemis III, production of the Orion spacecraft and SLS Core Stage should be critical paths for those programs' support of that mission. We're watching to see when the European service module is completed by Airbus at their Bremen, Germany assembly and test facility, and when the module is shipped to KSC. For Core Stage 3, we're watching assembly and test of the engine section at KSC and the rest of the stage at Michoud. For Starship HLS, NASA had stated that the key decision point review was planned for the fall of 2023. That was the last that we heard, so we're watching for an update on that review, and in particular the formal agency baseline commitments to their stakeholders, such as Congress. The HLS schedule for Artemis III was a big discussion topic during 2023 as Starship flight testing began, and NASA's schedule commitment for the Artemis III HLS is a big watch item. Back in October, the word from Public Affairs was that the HLS initial capability key decision point C briefing to NASA leadership and the agency was still tracking for the fall. And then after that, the agency will, the statement was, the agency will determine after that when to establish the cost and schedule baseline. Similarly, for Gateway, the KDP-C review was planned to be completed by the end of the year. The update that we got at pretty much the same time from Public Affairs was that the Gateway program has briefed NASA leadership at that point, and the agency is working to establish a cost and schedule baseline for the initial Gateway capability, consisting of the combined power and propulsion element and habitation and logistics outpost element. NASA will provide a public update once that process is complete. Well, so now we're now a quarter past that point, and so or it will be time pretty quick here to ask public affairs to get to at least see if we can get an update on the status of this transition for the Gateway co-manifest vehicle from Phase B to Phase C. For the xEVA lunar spacesuits, the GAO report published at the end of November said that the preliminary design review was planned for that month, and that critical design review was planned for August, as we were saying earlier. And we're watching for announcements when those milestones are completed. Thanks for watching.